Okay, I guess we're going to start and leave the door open so that at least some air can flow in. Okay, so welcome to the, well, I think it's the third HHVM talk on this conference. It's not just only about HHVM, it's about the LAMP stack in general and how you might want to change things to even accommodate all the cool things you can do with HHVM. So let's start with the first introduction. And I think the projector doesn't really like me. Let's see if we can fix that. Better. OK, so that's obviously me. And I'm working with PHP for, well, over a decade, as people keep telling me, which means I'm obviously getting old. I'm a security paranoid, which usually means that when people want to have code reviews, that I'm the guy doing the security audits on that stuff. And I'm usually a system architect. That means I'm designing the infrastructure or help people building the infrastructure. So HHVM is obviously quite some important part in that. And that's why it came to be that I'm going to give a presentation on it. I'm author of some open source software, but that's not too important. This is just marketing. So let's just go on. And as I already started in the beginning, small disclaimer, this is not a talk on how you're going to configure or change or modify or whatever things you might have to do to get common or famous open source software to run on HHVM. This is just about the stack and how to get things done and how to get the stack installed. So if you're hoping for like the most important quirk or configuration hint to get WordPress run on HHVM or Drupal or whatever kind of thing, this is not your presentation. So I hope I'm not going to get too many people upset with that, but this is just focusing on the stack in general. OK, so let's take a bit of a journey back into time. And the original stack, which gave the abbreviation LAMP, as in LAMP, is, of course, Linux as the operating system, Apache as the web server, even though that's obviously just a software group, not necessarily a software. MySQL, also just a software and a company, but never mind. And PHP as a module within the web server. The biggest problem with that is, at some point in time, people realized that having the web server and the PHP in one has the benefit for everything that is just PHP, but has a really bad impact on performance and everything as soon as you're going to deliver static content like images, CSS files, whatever, that don't involve PHP at all. Because you are going to initialize PHP along the way, because it's in a module form, it's within the web server, even though you don't need it. So people realized, OK, you know what? We have to change that, and we're going to swap over to a different web server where we can actually separate that stuff. So having Nginx, for example, you could also, of course, use light HTTPD, but I think hardly anybody heard about that being developed, actually. So I think this is on a rather declining state. Nginx, on the other hand, is getting really, really popular. And the most important difference is that it refuses to have like modules like mod.php included. There are some modules in there, of course, but they are really small and just basically adding core functionality. So if you decide to go away from HTTP daemons by Apache and swap over or switch over to Nginx, you're going to have to realize that running PHP is not the same anymore as it was before, even though from your application point of view, nothing really has to change. But the configuration point is really different. What Nginx requires you is to have PHP as a separate process, which sounds really bizarre if you're only going to do standard HTTP requests that always and always require PHP to be executed, basically on a web service, for example. But as soon as you have like both things, static files, as I mentioned before, and PHP on the other hand, this is genius, because the web server can do what a web server is being designed for, deliver content. And as soon as there's something dynamic, it's going to forward that request to the actual PHP process doing everything for you. So they are individual processes. And individual processes can be configured individually, and they can run individually, and they can be run on multiple machines individually. Funny thing is, quite many installations, you can see outside there, people have Nginx as a load balancer up front to forward the request to the actual standard Apache PHP combination, which makes, from the technical perspective, everything just look fine. You still have the separation, but you still have way too much overhead on the PHP machine, because you don't really need the HTTP level on that. Nginx can talk over fast AGI, and PHP has PHP FPM. And PHP-FPM is the fastCGI process manager, meaning it's going to run as a standalone process, speaking with the fastCGI protocol to whatever server who wants to talk to it. And with Nginx, that's obviously the best partner you can get, and it can be run locally over network or whatever kind of socket, interface, whatever you think makes most sense for you. So the coolest thing in this idea is you have the web server and whatever kind of concept the web server might be using. Nginx, for example, uses events internally, so there's just one process and spawning event handling internally. Apache uses the forks or threading, depending on what operating system you're on. This is web stuff. And PHP, even though it might create HTML stuff, this is not really HTTP related. It's something completely different. It's running software. And the result is going to be sent over HTTP. Fine, but PHP is not involved in that, at least not by default. So the idea of having the web server having its process and the process farm and handling process, whatever it thinks makes most sense, is cool on one hand. And on the other hand, having PHP over here doing the same thing, handling its processes as it sees fit. So you can have a bunch of PHP processes waiting to be ready to be executed. So you can just have, like, for example, say, OK, I'm going to add a worker pool here of PHP stacks and say, OK, this is 10, 20, 100, whatever you need of waiting PHP processes. And we have the web server on this side, and it's going to choose whatever free process is here to forward the request to. So this is really simple balancing on both sides. So you don't have to have one big fat server for everything, but you can really dedicate hardware and CPU time to whatever use case you have most interest in. So let's see how that looks from the configuration perspective. And if you're used to a little bit of how the Apache configuration might look like, this is not that different, except that the brackets or the tag things from the Apache configuration moved into curly braces, so to say. And this is just a server section, so I'm trying to keep the samples really, really small. And of course, you have like the standard document root, which is just root, because it doesn't really matter if it's a document, it's just like the root directory. And you have location matches. And one of the coolest thing, at least from my perspective, in what Nginx can do is having in location slash, so everything that's basically the standard path, if there's no specific match to it, is going to match with this thing. So this is basically a regular expression in a very simple form. You can even have regular expressions in a complex form in here. This is just really a simple example. So basically, all requests are going to match to this small section. And the cool thing here is it says try files, the requested URI. So what the web server is going to do is it's going to check if that particular requested URI is matching a file that's under this directory structure. If it is, it's going to deliver it. If it is not, well, it's going to be forwarded to this location. And since this is not a location, even though that's from the syntactical point of view a location as well, it's not a location you can specify from the outside. It's not never going to match. You can use whatever kind of key here and then have it forwarded to the actual PHP processing. So with this simple thing, you basically tell the web server everything that's actually a local file, just deliver it, and don't bother telling anybody. Just do it. As soon as you don't find this file, forward the request to PHP. This, of course, has the negative side effect that if people come up with really crazy file names or whatever kind of requests, they're all going to end up at the PHP level. So you don't necessarily directly get a 404. But this is not the standard thing to expect, that people come up with really bizarre requests. And if you have a somewhat sane routing, it's not going to be that expensive on the PHP level anyways to realize, OK, this is not a request I can handle. What also is quite interesting to notice is that this script file name that we have in this line, in my example, is static. That means pretty much every modern web application has one base file. Usually it's called index.php, or in my case, bootstrap.php. So every request is going to go through that single file. I don't need the generic file name matching or whatever kind of bizarre things anymore, and I don't need any complex rewrite rules or anything. I'm just going to forward all requests to that particular script. Of course, you can say, OK, I don't really want this. I want to have the old way of doing it. Then you just have to pass in the URI again as a parameter in here, and then it's going to be relative to that. Another thing that you might notice is that this bootstrap file here is not under the document root. That's quite helpful, because The web server doesn't need to know that particular file because it's never going to actually deliver it. It's going to be executed. It's code. So it's going to be run by PHP. So theoretically, this particular path does not even have to be on the same server. All we're telling in this configuration setting here is, you know what, pass it on to this IP address on that particular port, and then run this particular script. If this is the same machine, okay, based on this IP address, it obviously is. But if it's a different IP address, it's going to be a different machine, and that path is not on the same box. So you have now what people actually hoped for quite a while. You have a web server, which is just a web server, and everything else is on an application server. You don't need to have actual source code on the web server anymore, which is quite helpful, at least from a security perspective. And remember, I'm a security paranoid, so I should know. At least be afraid enough to actually care. OK, so having separated concerns, web server, web stuff, PHP stuff. So as I said before, this is one single thing. And how this actual service is executed, as in how many PHP processes are waiting, it's something you have to configure on PHPM level, which is not something we're going to cover today. But of course, having one single machine is not necessarily helpful in scaling. So the cool thing is, as I said also before, Nginx is quite often used as a load balancer, usually load balancing to HTTP daemons on the back end, so basically playing proxy. But it can also do the same thing with the PHP pool. So you can say, OK, I'm going to create an upstream element, give it a name, in this case PHP pool, and then define whatever amount of servers I want. And the cool thing is, otherwise it wouldn't be really load balancing, is you can specify all kinds of attributes along. And the most important part here is that having the weight telling, OK, it's more likely that this server is going to be picked. This is just a generic load balancing mechanism. You can specify the weights, and you can say, OK, if this machine fails to reply on 3 requests, we're going to time out it for 30 seconds. So it's not even going to get stuck if one of the machines are down. It's going to realize, OK, the third attempt to this box did not return a valid reply within recent timeouts. We're going to fail this machine for 30 seconds. So it's not going to get requests all the time. Because maybe it's just simply overloaded, and Nginx doesn't know about it. So 30 seconds wait time might solve the problem. You can, of course, configure those values as you like. Another cool thing is the backup in here. This particular box is not going to get any traffic unless one of those things are down. So you can even create hot standby machines in that context, which is quite helpful. Of course, you need to map this stuff back into the configuration. And the only thing that changed compared to the thing before is that the fastAGI pass here now has just the key name of my pool. Quite simple so far, right? The cool thing is, with all this matching things here and all the pools and configurations, this is all the time adding ports. So of course, I can now even decide to run different PHP versions at the same point in time by simply having different PHP stacks on different ports. So let's say I'm going to create a PHP pool for 5.3 or for 5.5 and for 5.4, maybe beta or 5.6, whatever. Just different ports. They may be even on the same machine. And then configure a different location entry and say, OK, you know, we have this particular part of software. Maybe, for example, we had to embed a forum which doesn't work with PHP 5.5 but requires PHP 5.3. Well, then just match a location on forum and then forward all the requests to the 5.3 pool. Since it's not part of the web server anymore, it can be used at any particular spot, and you can decide even on a per file basis, actually, you know, I'm going to forward this to this particular type of pool and this particular configuration, which can also be quite helpful. Quite many people run software that has different tasks to accomplish at the same point in time, or at least in the site in general. Saying, for example, you have a standard website for browsing, and there's a functionality, for example, upload pictures, and they have to get rescaled, or check for viruses, whatever. So this is obviously a bit of a more complex task, so it might require more memory. Now, it doesn't make any sense to have the standard browsing processes run forever and consume memory like crazy just because one single aspect of the application might require this. With this typical approach, you can say, OK, if it's the upload script, we're going to forward it to a specific location, which is just going to have more memory assigned and longer runtimes. Everything else has to exit within 5 seconds and has to only reuse whatever kind of small amount of memory. So that's really easy to scale things and to limit things and even to limit side effects in case you realize people are attacking you and you have a script that's going to be limited in its resources, there's hardly any impact on it. As soon as you allow everybody to do everything, just because one tiny aspect may eventually require more permissions or more memory, more CPU time, whatever, you're going to end up having problems if somebody is trying to attack you. And as soon as you scale it out into smaller processes and in smaller pools, there doesn't have to be a pool of like hundreds of machines. It can just be one single instance. It's perfectly fine. You can even run different configurations on the same machine just to limit everything. So you can also run the PHP FPM process as a different user, saying, okay, this is the standard application is running as PHP or Nginx or whatever kind of user that makes sense for you. And this particular process is running as a different user because it needs to run different things, has different permissions. It's really easy to make small, tiny boxes that are isolated and just limited to a certain requirement and nothing else, which is really, really helpful. So with this particular change, yes, the question.
Just a question. What about Xdebug in this equation? I mean, how would I put it in this context?
It's the same. It's just an extension to PHP, and you can decide, for whatever reason, to have, for example, you want to have the same or the standard website run without Xdebug, but certain area where you're debugging in, for example, have a configuration setting that's going to run that on a particular stack, one FPM stack, where you load Xdebug, for example.
Okay.
In general, I wouldn't recommend running Xdebug on production because it's having quite some impact. XHProf would be easier if you're not debugging, but just seeing performance data. XHProf does not have any runtime impact unless actually enabled. So XHProf would be easier and less painful in terms of performance. But I would simply create a different pool for that. I don't really, depends on your context. It's really hard to answer in a generic way if that makes sense or not. But you can, of course, have different configurations with different extensions loaded as well. You don't need to have, for example, the ImageMagick extension enabled if nobody uses it except for one script. Then you create one pool that only has that. That makes the PHP binary smaller again. By default, everybody thinks like, okay, we need a one-size-fits-all configuration, which is perfectly fine if you have just one machine and it's only a small amount of requests. But if you start to realize that you're losing quite some CPU time, memory, and all these resources that are actually quite valuable if the server starts to hit a certain level of activity, it makes a lot of sense to reduce the binary size that's actually running to a really small amount. And only that particular one that the majority of things need, and everything else needs to get scaled out to a different process. I mean, there's still one process running with all the extensions, or at least one more, for example, the ImageMagick thing for rescaling and working with images. But everything else is running on the smallest possible thing. And then the majority of things are running smaller. So you have like hundreds of requests with hardly any memory usage, and you have only one process that whatever request amount. Maybe it's two. It really depends on how much you have to scale. Yes?
But which relocation is then used for ImageMagick? Is that only based on the script file name? So I need to know, okay, that's my requested file, or whatever, create image.php, and then I will forward that directly to location ImageMagick. Well,
it has to be something the web server can determine. So if it's somewhat in the path that you can determine that as a rule, then that will work. You can even have it look into the post request. So if you see it's an upload request, as in it's on post, and to this particular type of URL, then route it. You can add various, it's really, I'm trying to keep the smallest examples here. Nginx has a really powerful configuration thing. You can even write scripts in there to configure various things dynamically and have decisions based on headers and IP addresses. You can even say, okay, if I'm running on a local IP address or a range I know, then we're going to forward it to whatever stack with Xdebug enabled, for example, and everybody else is going to get to the stack that has no Xdebug enabled. This is really flexible, but you have to come up with a pattern that actually the web server can see. So it has to be something within the HTTP request, one way or another. Okay? Okay. So with that particular change, we managed something very important. Bless you. We are now technically ready for HHVM. The reason why we are now ready and not just before is that with mod.php, everything is loaded within the web server. And technically, HHVM does not exist as a module because it doesn't make any sense for them to create it. I mean, it's software Facebook created, and they don't run HTTP daemons by Apache, so they didn't have any interest in doing so. It even took them quite some convincing to implement FastCGI because they have their own way of handling things. So I don't know if anybody attended Sebastian's talk on HHVM earlier. Everything HHVM does is basically created because Facebook had a need for it. So you have to keep in mind, if it's not your problem that Facebook is solving, it's their problem. So in case your problem is not their problem, then you might not having this particular binary or this tiny of support that you actually wanted. In this particular case, Facebook hardly had a need for FastCGI, but they realized it makes sense if they want to have a bit of a public audience and more people actually make use of it. So FastCGI support got added. And for that to work, I mean, yes, I know Apache theoretically has third-party modules for FastCGI as well, but their support is so limited and so many things don't work that I don't think it's worth actually mentioning it. I just do it for the sake of the argument that actually is there. So people don't claim, yeah, Apache can do this as well. Well, it can talk to FastCGI, but it's not the same what Nginx can do. So having this tiny split, we are ready for HHVM because now we have the web server and we have PHP as one binary, and we're just going to replace PHP by HHVM. So HHVM is a standalone thing. It's pretty much the same from executing than PHP would have been by FastCGI means, as in running PHP FPM. You can run it from a command line, and of course you have to install it. The easiest way, at least if you're running Red Hat distributions, is to create a YAM repository, or actually not really create it, but just configure it. So this is a configuration file, hhvm.repo. So far, Facebook does not really care too much about actually releasing install scripts for that, so you just have to do that manually, which is a really simple configuration file. It's the same for every repo type. Basically, you specify the path where the stuff needs to be fetched from. You enable it. You say you want to run the GPG check on the files, and this is where the GPG file would be located. This, of course, can be skipped, at least in theory, but again, the security paranoid. I wouldn't install any software that's not been signed by anyone that I, at least to some extent, trust. And since they released their public key for it, I'm going to install that key, and at least I know if something is really broken with it, at least I know Facebook screwed up and not somebody else managed to hack in between. So for that to work, we, of course, have to get this particular file first. And that's actually quite simple. We just have to get this file. This is available on the download page from them. And we just place it into the path that we just have configured in the previous slide, as in this directory here. So this is really simple. Just wget to get the file there. And then we are basically already set to install it. There's not really any big magic. Of course, you can get the source code. They have all the sources on GitHub, and you can compile it yourself. They have some patched libraries that they require. So it's even having sub-repositories included. So, and it takes quite some time to compile. I tried to compile it on this machine, and it took, I think, like 9 hours or so in total, just because I don't have the much scaling power. I mean, it's a laptop CPU, so it's not necessarily built to be really, really fast. So it takes really some time. But once it's compiled in general, I mean, it's a C program to some extent. So once it's done and you only change tiny things, it's getting faster in recompiling it. But to me, at least if I want to install an operating system, I'm going to use precompiled packages. So if I'm going to add additional components, I'm going to use precompiled components as well. That's a matter of trusting the vendor, of course, sure. But mixing manual installs and using operating system installs is not necessarily very helpful if you want to maintain a bunch of servers. It may be OK for testing purposes. And I even compile HHVM sometimes myself, now using my own server, which has a bunch of more CPUs, so it's going a lot faster. And then create packages myself, so I can install packages on here again. So that's just easier to manage. Speaking of installing, this is all we have to do once we have configured the repository. It pretty much works the same way if you have a Debian Ubuntu system. Of course, you're not going to use YAM, you're going to use apt-get. But it's the same concept. You just add the sources repository, the apt repository from them. It's on the same machine. It's just a different path. And you can install it with apt-get install HHVM. So same thing. Once we got it installed, we are pretty much ready to roll. And we can just start it as a FastCGI server. The reason why this is actually having mode server is that HHVM by itself is pretty much the same as PHP. You can just run PHP and then give it a file name, and then it's going to execute it. But in this case, we want to have it as a server. So they have everything in one binary. They don't have PHP FPM or FastCGI as a specific binary. It's just a switch on the command line. And since we are, in case we are upgrading or moving over, and we didn't stop the PHP process yet, we have a conflict because this port obviously is already taken. And now, again, something really cool comes into play, because if we're going to change the port here, we can decide, again, based on the directory or on the request or whatever kind of pattern we want to use as a decision maker, whether we want to run this particular code with PHP or with HHVM. So you can have both. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not one or the other. You can have both. The cool thing is, even if you have a session, the serialization format is, of course, identical. So you can store stuff in a session from HHVM and then read it later on with standard PHP again. It just works. It's doing all the same things. So it's really easy to realize, OK, you know, this is taking too long, and this works with HHVM already, so we're just going to run this with HHVM, but everything else is not necessarily stable yet, so we're going to split the processes and just have some processes run with HHVM and others don't. That's fairly easy, and I think it's quite powerful. OK, since we don't have any specific IP addresses or any kind of configuration, obviously it's going to be local. And quite many people realize using local and IP address is kind of stupid, so because we have sockets for that. So we can use sockets, of course, as well. And even though it's been installed by a package, in this case an RPM package or a Debian package, we have to configure the path names where the socket is going to be. And then can run this. I'm using this as Nginx, which means that also Nginx is able to access the socket. Otherwise, it's going to be quite hard for the web server to communicate with the socket server. So it's the same thing, speaking FastCGI just over the socket. And of course, I would have to adjust the HHVM, not the Nginx configuration, to use the socket and not the IP address in this case as well. But this is the same thing, just replacing the IP by Unix : and then the path to the socket. OK, the headline is actually completely wrong. That shouldn't mean it makes a service. So if you look at this particular service file, later versions of, I think, pretty much every Linux distribution these days is going to use not the old initd system anymore, but, well, systemd. And to make it a service, because obviously if you run an actual server, you don't want to restart the server manually all the time and want to run something on a command line. So we have to have a service. So this is basic configuration. I cannot even type. What did I do? It's a FastCGI, not a RASCGI service. Jeez. OK, so telling it's a simple service. We want to run this. It's pretty much exactly the same thing that we had before. I even ended up at the end. It's the same thing that you would run on the command line. Just tell it, OK, you know, we want to have it run after the syslog and network started, because otherwise we're going to have a problem communicating. And then, OK, on a multi-user target, that's a standard thing, just making sure the stuff actually runs in standard services. So this is really the basic thing. The cool thing is we still have quite some time left. That's perfect. Because what we ended up doing is we switched the right side, and we still left the left side, of course. And interesting thing is the HHVM is running on Linux, and it's running on macOS and on any other BSD. And currently, it's not running on Windows. For the same thing, as I said before, it's not Facebook's platform. Facebook doesn't care. It's the same thing with actually happened to PHP for quite a while, that nobody in the PHP core team cared enough about Windows. So nobody wrote a Windows port, and nobody maintained it. So it was pure luck if PHP would actually run on Windows or not. And it was Microsoft who had to actually take money into their hands and throw it at developers to make sure they actually maintain a Windows port. And this is the same for HHVM. There's no interest whatsoever. Nobody sane enough is running PHP FPM on Windows in a high-performance environment. That's the only environment where HHVM would actually make sense. So nobody needs to care about having HHVM on Windows. That makes, of course, development a bit harder if you want to develop on Windows, but that's what virtual machines are for, I would say. So the right thing is perfectly fine. Linux is probably going to stay. If you're actually going to need MySQL in your setup, pretty much depends on your environment and what you're going to do. It's actually quite helpful to replace the standard file system session stuff by Memcache or Redis or something. They are both extensions for PHP. They also work with HHVM, not the extensions, but the configuration logic works. So you can actually have the session stored in either thing. OK.
What's about the PHP extensions? Do they work in HHVM?
The extension itself, no. Everything that is not core PHP has to be ported to HHVM.
And are they ported?
The extension
there
itself?
There are really a lot of extensions there.
Yeah. The session safe handling on Redis seems to work. I haven't tried it myself. I've just been told it works. So I cannot really tell. Facebook is using Memcache for everything. So I'm 100% sure they have a working Memcache implementation. Memcached that's in the newer API. Every other extension, of course, if you have your own Zend extension or any kind of thing. Xdebug won't work in HHVM either. I mean, it's a PHP extension, so it's not going to work. The cool thing is that with HHVM, you can really easily create your own extensions because they have basically an API that allows you to write that in more or less userland code. So it's pretty much PHP code that you can use to bind in a C library, for example. So it's technically easy, but it's, of course, not the same. So if you require specific extensions that the Facebook team did not yet port or care enough about to actually implement fully, then you're out of luck, and then you need to go the split way. Or if it doesn't work because every request needs those extensions, then, well, then HHVM is not for you, at least not yet. OK. I don't have that many slides anymore because I want to discuss a few things. And I hope you're still not falling asleep, even though it's getting really warm in here. At least I'm sweating like crazy. Just in general, who had heard of HHVM before coming here? That's everybody almost. That's perfect. OK, who is actually considering or even using it already? OK, of the people who just voted, who is using it? OK, what's your experience?
Well, I'm using it for WordPress.
OK.
WordPress blog. I think I'm an early adopter. I started with version 1 group.
OK.
It's fine. The community is great. The Facebook team is very helpful. So far, I'm excited. It's really fast.
And stable?
Oh, yeah. There have been a few WordPress bugs.
OK.
But they also get fixed really fast.
OK. OK, cool. The interesting, or the reason why I'm asking is that quite many people come to us and like, hey, do we need HHVM? And this is obviously a question that's not really easy to answer, and that I wanted to check if anybody else is caring to find out that answer. And as I said before, even though for WordPress, which is a quite famous open source project, especially in the US, there's bound to be really good support for it sooner or later. As soon as you have specific problems yourself, you always have to remember, at least the way it works currently, is for Facebook, this is basically a spin-off of their own needs. And if they have time and an interest to actually fix the problem, they're going to work on it. Otherwise, you are free to fix it yourself, which probably means you have to understand C and C++ code to actually write it in their code base. And it's not guaranteed to be adopted. There's a bunch of pull requests on GitHub that they don't care to merge yet for various reasons. Sometimes it's like, oh, we don't like this coding style. But quite often it's like, yeah, we have to sign all kinds of legal things first because we are having intellectual property stuff in here, which is like the standard US problem of intellectual property. And the other thing is, it may not even be faster than before. Of course, the PHP part is going to be faster. But depending on your application and what it's doing, it might not actually have any benefits. If your example, just for example, take the image that I mentioned earlier. So you have PHP code that's going to accept an uploaded file, which is supposed to be an image, and then rescale it and then save it somewhere. Yes, the PHP part can be faster, but chances are you're actually using an extension to do the image handling, which already is C, so it's not going to be any faster anyhow. So same thing for a database. If you have an application that's reading and writing to a database constantly and can't do anything by itself except doing really complex queries all the time, well, the application is going to wait faster, but that's not necessarily going to help you. So the decision whether or not HHVM is for you depends, of course, first of all, if all the features that you require are already implemented. And there's a bunch of extensions that are there. Quite some of them are partially there, and quite some just are on their plan to be ported or to be added later. And of course, it really depends if it's going to be worth the hassle. If you already made the change, as I demonstrated back from Apache Go to Nginx, then it's really easy to use it as a drop-in replacement, just give it a try. If you actually have to change all the stack things first, then I recommend that you actually do this first and make sure that you have a stable environment with Nginx and PHP FPM, because then switching over and even having tiny parts swapped over where you actually might see a benefit, that's exactly what you're going to need, and that's going to help you most. It's not, I have to run HHVM 100%. This may work for many applications, but it's not a requirement. Having this split brain kind of approach, deciding to put various things on HHVM where the CPU enhancement actually makes a lot of sense, fine, just do it. The current situation really is interesting, and it's, of course, there are more things happening. I mean, it's not just like HHVM. There's other projects that compile PHP code. There's this PHP NG project that's maybe some people heard about, that the Zen team that wrote the original engine decided to spend quite some time and energy on enhancing the actual standard PHP. So whatever PHP version comes next, not 5.6, but maybe 5.7 or even 6, depending on what they choose to use next, might have PHP NG in it. Maybe, maybe not. They're not really clear on that yet. But this is also going to be quite a lot faster again, with all the other stuff still working, of course. So it really depends what fits your needs best. And as much as I would like to, I cannot really answer that for anybody. We can look at it in case you need us. I mean, we're consultants after all, so you can buy our knowledge for money. But it's still something you have to look at basically yourself and decide it yourself. I, for myself, try all my software with HHVM, and I have, I think 5 or 6 bugs that are still open. And so not everything that I wrote works flawlessly with HHVM yet. But it's at least interesting to realize that at least a lot of things that you do in actual PHP is a lot faster, of course. But all the benchmarks are really cool if they just do PHP-only stuff. As soon as you rely on lots of extensions, and even if you do XML stuff, the majority of things happens in libxml. So if libxml is slow, HHVM is not going to make it faster. libxml, luckily, is relatively fast, but still, there are various things where the PHP execution and the speed of it is not going to cause that much of a big impact on your application. OK, we have roughly 7 minutes for questions, in case there are questions, or it's warm in here. So I would perfectly understand if everybody was like, I have questions, but I don't care. I just have to get out of here. That's perfectly fine as well. I'm here for questions anyway. Yes?
One question is that possible to add a memcached server directly to the Nginx server to store JS, CSS, or image files and make that sense?
Yeah.
Or is there an own Nginx storage cacheable engine, or is that just I/O traffic?
Well, everything in memory is fast, of course. So I would probably recommend simply using a file system as in tmpfs, which is in memory. That kills both problems. You have the file system in memory, so it's a standard file system. You can easily access it from outside without any special tools. But you can have extensions to Nginx for Redis. I think for memcache as well, but I never looked at it because I'm usually using Redis for pretty much anything that's key value store related. And you can serve files and whatever kind of things from Redis directly. Yes?
We are currently using an Apache load balancer, and behind that load balancer are other web servers based on Apache servers. And now we will switch over to the Nginx construct, and use that what you are showing us here. And well done.
Thank you. OK, any more questions? OK, I think everybody is fed up. It's way too warm in here. So, one question, yes?
Well, it's an Nginx related question. Do you have any experience between using Nginx with the socket and using it with IP and port regarding the performance? Because I've read a lot that using the socket is like 10 till 15% much faster than port IP.
If it's local, yes, of course, it's fastest.
Okay.
Yeah. IP stuff always has connecting, handshake, all kinds of things. Even though it's local, it's still IP. So it has an overhead. And yes, you're going to notice that on a really loaded machine. If it's just like you run a test environment on, you're not going to notice the difference.
Okay.
But on really loaded machines, you're going to see it. The funny thing is that if you have high traffic sites, this is not really a question anymore because you're not going to have the web server and PHP on the same machine anyway. So you cannot use sockets. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well then, thanks for coming. Thanks for bearing with me.